The Mirror Room. I am Sarah Mitchell. I am a 28-year-old woman running an antique shop in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The story I am about to tell you is about events that happened to me last year in a desolate area in northern Vermont. Some of you may not believe it, but I swear every word is true. These events have changed my life forever, and now, after a year has passed, I finally have the strength to share them. Before everything started, I had a normal life. After graduating from university 5 years ago, I opened a shop called Mitchell's Antiques with a small inheritance from my grandmother. My shop was located on the ground floor of an old red brick building in the historic district of Portsmouth. I lived in my small apartment on the upper floor. I was very close to my 30-year-old sister, Emma, who lived with her husband, Tom, on the other side of town and was pregnant with their first child. My shop had gradually started to grow. I specialized particularly in Victorian furniture. I would travel all over New England, collecting pieces from old houses and auctions. Emma usually accompanied me on these treasure hunts, but she was now pregnant and the doctor had advised her to rest. My story begins in October 2023. That morning when I opened the shop, I first checked my emails as usual. I saw an interesting ad on online antique forums. Items from an old mansion located in northern Vermont, near the Canadian border, were being sold. The person who posted the ad was a man in his 50s named Frank Morrison. He was selling the house that his family had lived in for generations. The furniture in the photos excited me. There was a particular display cabinet that was exactly the type Mrs. Henderson, one of my customers, had been looking for months. Moreover, the prices were quite reasonable. The only problem was that I had to go there in person to see and collect the items. I called Emma, but as I suspected, she wouldn't be able to come. "Sarah, please be careful," she said over the phone. "I don't like the idea of you going to an unknown place alone." "Don't worry, Em," I said with a laugh. "It's just a man and some old furniture. What could possibly go wrong?" Oh, how I wish I had listened to my sister. The next morning I set off early. I packed my thermos, a few sandwiches, and road snacks into my small Volkswagen. I entered the address into the GPS and headed north. The first hour was on the main road. Autumn is the most beautiful season in New England. The trees were adorned in crimson and golden hues. In the second hour, the GPS directed me off the main road. The paved road turned into a dirt road. There were a few old farmhouses scattered around, and they were quite far apart. At one point, the GPS signal was lost, but I was able to find my way thanks to the written directions Frank had provided. The sun was starting to set early. It was only around 4 p.m., but the sky had already begun to gray. The wind had picked up, shaking my car. There was nothing but static on the radio. Finally, through the trees, the mansion came into view. The photos on the online ad had only shown part of the building. In front of me stood a 3-story Victorian-style, massive house with grayed wooden sidings. The wide veranda was lined with rocking chairs that were swaying back and forth in the wind. I parked my car in front of the house. I took my flashlight out of the trunk. Electricity could always be an issue in these old houses. Just then, I saw movement on the veranda. Frank Morrison was coming down the steps. He was a tall, thin man. His gray hair reached his shoulders, and he was wearing a dark, outdated suit. "Welcome, Miss Mitchell," he said with a smile. His voice was soft and kind, but there was a strange expression in his eyes. "Did you find your way all right?" "Yes, thank you, Mr. Morrison. The GPS gave me a bit of trouble, but I finally made it. Please come in. Let me show you around the house first." Most of the items for sale are on the upper floors. As we stepped onto the veranda, the wind intensified. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Frank opened the door and we went inside. The interior was decorated in classic Victorian style. The walls were covered in dark wood paneling, and crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. White covers draped over the furniture looked like ghostly silhouettes. There was an old wood smell in the air, mixed with mothballs and another strange metallic scent that I couldn't quite identify. The house was built by my great-grandfather in the 1870s. Frank began as we climbed the wide staircase. Back then, this area was for timber barons. My great-grandfather was one of them. The family has lived here for generations. Until what? I asked when he paused. Until it got too old, he quickly said. I decided to move to the city. This house is too big for one person. The house was built by my great-grandfather in the 1870s. Frank began as we climbed the wide staircase. Back then, this area was for timber barons. My great-grandfather was one of them. The family has lived here for generations. Until what? I asked when he paused. Until it got too old, he quickly said. I decided to move to the city. This house is too big for one person. As we ascended to the second floor, I listened to the echo of our footsteps on the wooden stairs. The worn carpet seemed to bear the weight of centuries. Every corner of Frank's house smelled of history. Old paintings hanging on the stone walls and the faded wallpaper all seemed to mark the passage of time. I glanced at a few paintings as we walked. It felt as though the eyes of the figures were following my every step. When we reached the top of the stairs, Frank paused for a moment and gestured with his hand to a large room on the left. Let's take a break here, he said. He opened the door to the room and we stepped inside. There were old velvet-covered armchairs and a large fireplace. The embers in the fireplace were still gently glowing, as if the entire house was kept warm by it. On a table, there was a silver tray. The coffee cups and the small cookies arranged beside them were eye-catching. Let me offer you some coffee. Our conversations about antiques might take a while, he said with a smile. While sipping my coffee, I moved to the window and looked outside. The day was slowly turning into the afternoon. The shadows of the trees in the garden were beginning to lengthen. My eyes then wandered to the old lighting fixtures hanging on the walls. Each of them was from a time before electricity. After we had our coffee for a while, Frank took out a few old maps from a large cabinet beside his desk. These maps show the old plans of the house and the property. Every corner of this house holds a secret. Before my antique collection, the history of the property fascinated me. After we both looked at the maps for a while, Frank quietly got up from his seat and headed towards the second floor. I followed him, and he finally pointed to a large double door at the end of the corridor. This room houses my special collection. As an antiques dealer, it might interest you, he said. When he opened the door, I was breathless at what I saw. The room was entirely filled with mirrors. Every wall, from floor to ceiling, was covered with antique mirrors of various sizes and styles. Some gleamed in gilded frames, others were intricately carved in wood, and some were frameless, standing out with their simplicity. My family has collected mirrors for generations, Frank said with a proud voice. Each one has its own story. Some are from Europe, others were bought from local auctions. They are all at least 100 years old. As I stood in the middle of the room, I could see myself from hundreds of angles. A strange feeling enveloped me. It seemed as if not only myself but everything in the room was endlessly repeating. From outside, I had seen that this room had windows, but inside, the walls were entirely covered with mirrors. It created a bizarre feeling of entrapment. These mirrors are not for sale, Frank said, as if reading my thoughts. I will take them to my new home in the city. But first I need to tell you a story. This room has a story, Miss Mitchell. And you might be just the person we've been looking for. His tone suddenly changed. He no longer sounded like the kind host, but like someone else entirely. I took a step toward the door, but Frank grabbed my arm. His hand was ice cold, and I felt a shiver of fear in that moment. I need to show you the oval mirror, he said. The small one in the corner. Reluctantly, I looked. It was an oval mirror with a dark wooden frame. Strange symbols were carved into it. Spirals and angular marks I couldn't decipher. While my reflection in the other mirrors looked normal, in this one, it was different. When I turned my head, my reflection should have turned too. But for a brief moment, it continued to look straight ahead. Where did this mirror come from? I asked, my voice trembling. When Frank let go of my arm, I felt a slight sense of relief. But the longer I stayed in this room full of mirrors, the more my unease grew. As I looked around, I didn't want to stand in this place where every reflection seemed to be watching me. I tried to look at the mirrors from different angles, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the oval mirror. The strange symbols on its frame seemed to dance before my eyes. For a moment, I felt as if I was suspended in time, neither moving forward nor backward, just lost among the endless reflections of the mirrors. These mirrors are truly impressive, but I think I've spent too much time in this room, I said, my voice barely hiding a tremor. Frank watched me closely. There was a look in his eyes that suggested he understood exactly what I was thinking. He tilted his head slightly and smiled. "Of course," he said softly. "This room can make one feel strange, especially if it's your first time here. There's another place I want to show you. It might make you feel more at ease." The idea of leaving the heavy atmosphere of the room was appealing, so I nodded silently. Frank opened the door and led me back into the corridor. We passed the large hall downstairs and climbed up a set of less grand, but equally old wooden stairs. The creaking sound of the steps complemented the aged atmosphere of the house. After walking a bit further, Frank opened another wood-paneled door. As I stepped inside, we entered a completely different atmosphere. Unlike the previous cold and eerie ambience of the house, this room was warm and nostalgic. There were a few old armchairs in front of a large fireplace. The walls were adorned with old family photos. Compared to the rest of the house, this place felt more lived in. Frank placed an old family album on the table and smiled at me. "This is the room where my family keeps its most cherished memories," he said in a calm voice. "Perhaps you'd like to spend some time here and have something to drink." For a moment, I felt distanced from the dark influence of the mirror room. This part of the house looked more comfortable and inviting. "That sounds good," I said. Frank smiled and walked slowly towards the kitchen. As I carefully looked around, I noticed that every item in the room seemed to defy time. The armchairs, the antique clock above the fireplace, and the framed pictures on the walls. Each one seemed to belong to a different era. When Frank returned, he had 2 cups of coffee in hand. He handed me one and sat down in the armchair opposite me. We drank our coffee in silence for a while. I felt calmer. The intense pressure I had felt among the mirrors had vanished. Frank broke the silence by suggesting I stay a bit longer. He offered to make one of his famous dishes for dinner. Although I was initially hesitant about staying, the idea of remaining in this relaxing atmosphere began to make more sense. "Maybe I could stay for dinner," I said hesitantly. Frank nodded with a pleased expression and headed toward the kitchen. After moving to the dining room, Frank brought out a simple yet delicious meal he had prepared. The plain setting of the table was comforting after the antique atmosphere in the house. The red wine he poured into the glasses took on a deeper hue in the candlelight, adding a gentle warmth to the room. Our conversation flowed calmly throughout the meal. Frank spoke about the memories his family had gathered over the years. Occasionally, his eyes would drift to the antique paintings hanging in the corners of the room. Towards the end of the meal, there was a brief moment. Frank paused, set his wine glass on the table, and looked at me intently. There was something in his eyes, a kind of intensity one couldn't decipher. With a slight smile, he said, "Having you here feels strangely familiar." For a moment, as he adjusted the shawl on my shoulders, his gaze noticeably slid down. That moment made me more aware of my surroundings. Frank quickly shifted his gaze and steered the conversation to a different topic, but that brief moment stayed with me. The discomfort mixed with a certain interest in my femininity became more pronounced, influenced by the atmosphere in the room. After dinner, we had coffee and sat for a while longer. During that time, the eerie sound of the light wind hitting the windows returned. The heaviness in the air was felt once more, but this time in a more mysterious way. "Would you consider staying?" Frank asked with sudden composure. "Spending the night in this house could be quite unforgettable." Initially I hesitated, but the idea of staying in a warm room instead of venturing out at this late hour became more appealing. My curiosity was also growing stronger. What secrets still lay undiscovered in this house, with this man? I think "I might stay," I said hesitantly. A slight smile appeared on Frank's face. "In that case, let's prepare the guest room upstairs for you. The night could be long." After entering the guest room, Frank closed the door and disappeared down the corridor. The room was simply furnished but had an eerie atmosphere. A large four-poster bed dominated the center of the room. The wooden floor creaked slightly, as if the house itself responded to every step I took. In the corner of the room, there was an old-fashioned dressing table. When I sat in front of the mirror, my reflection examining my face felt foreign for a moment. I took my thin nightgown from the dress hanger and put it on. The light touch of the straps exposing my shoulders sent a shiver down my spine. I left my shawl at the foot of the bed. As I fixed my hair in front of the mirror, Frank's gaze came to mind. That brief look added to the intensity one felt in the room. I even felt a sense of unfamiliarity in my own reflection, as if everything in the room was watching me. I lay down on the bed, but unease kept swirling inside me. The room was enveloped in a heavy silence. I stared at the ceiling for a while, trying to sleep. Just as my eyes began to close, I heard a faint noise from outside. I took a deep breath and listened intently. There were footsteps coming from the corridor and the voice of a woman whispering. Her words were unclear, but they somehow felt familiar. My heart started to race. Felt as if there was someone else there. I quietly got up and approached the door. I slightly opened the door. There was no one in the corridor, but the sound of footsteps gradually faded as if someone was walking away. I opened the door a bit more, and at that moment a deep, heartfelt woman's voice echoed again. "Don't go. There's still time." The voice was eerily close, but it wasn't coming from either the door or the room. I pulled back and quickly closed the door, returning to the bed. My heart was pounding. The darkness in the room had become more intense, and the sounds from outside had ceased. But the unease remained. I felt as if someone was watching me. With trembling hands, I pulled my shawl over my shoulders and held it tightly. In the dark, I awaited that voice, ready to hear it again at any moment. After a while, I fell into a deep sleep, but this peace did not last long. I felt a chill. The room had somehow become icy cold. It was as if I were dreaming, but everything felt all too real. When I opened my eyes, I noticed that the room looked different in the darkness. I glanced at the old mirror by my bedside, and at that moment I felt something was wrong. My reflection wasn't looking at me. It had risen from the bed and had its back turned to me. My heart began to race in my chest. I slowly turned my head towards the mirror. This time my reflection stared at me motionlessly. But as I moved, I saw my reflection continue to watch me. When I brought my hands to my face, the reflection did the same. However, there was something strange about its expression. It seemed as though it was smiling. I was in a panic, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. At that moment, another reflection appeared in the mirror. A woman standing behind me. I quickly turned my head, but there was no one behind me. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. At that moment, another reflection appeared in the mirror. A woman standing behind me. I quickly turned my head, but there was no one behind me. I took a deep breath and sprang out of bed. I was trying to understand what was happening, but that image in the mirror was etched into my mind. My legs trembling, I walked towards the door. I needed to get out of this house immediately. When I opened the door, I heard the woman's whispering voice again, but this time it was much closer. "Don't go. That mirror is calling you." Panicked, I slammed the door and quickly put on some clothes. Ignoring the trembling of my body, I started running down the corridor in my light nightgown. I could feel the fabric clinging to my skin, cold sweat dripping down my back. My heart was pounding so fast it felt like it could stop at any moment. I didn't even think to put on my shoes. My only goal was to escape that house as quickly as possible. My footsteps echoed on the wooden floors, and the sense of emptiness in the house grew with every step. The woman's voice still whispered behind me, as if trying to draw me in with its eerie tone. When I reached the stairs, I hesitated for a moment. I quickened my pace, stumbling a few times as I descended the stairs, but I didn't stop. I felt the cold stone under my feet, and when I reached the door, I flung it open with great speed. When I stepped outside, the cold night air hit my face. Even breathing became difficult, and my footsteps echoed on the gravel. As I opened the car door, my hands were trembling so much that I struggled to turn the key. The engine finally started, and I drove away from that house. As I drove, the headlights cut through the empty darkness. My heart was pounding so hard in my chest. It felt like it would explode any moment. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles turning white. The silence inside the car was deafening. But in my mind, that image in the mirror kept replaying. The faint outline of the woman and my reflection staring back at me with empty eyes. What was this? Was it real? Or was it just a trick my mind was playing on me? A slight shiver ran through my body. As I drove down the road in the headlights' glow, I thought about the mirrors. Frank's words came to mind. Old cursed mirrors, pieces carrying different stories. But that oval mirror, it was different from the others. It felt as though it had called me, drawn me in. When I reached my home that night, it would be impossible for me to look at mirrors for a while. I had to stay away from those reflections. That woman should not appear before me again. In the oppressive silence inside the car, one question echoed in my mind. What had I seen in that mirror? Why had the image felt so familiar to me? It felt as if I had lived this before. Or was I facing someone else's fate? Perhaps the stories Frank had told were more than just tales. Maybe a truly cursed mirror had chosen me. When I arrived home, I couldn't stop questioning all these events in my mind. As I entered my bedroom, I noticed the small mirror on the wall and avoided looking at it. Taking a deep breath, I lay down on the bed. My heart was still racing, but deep inside, I felt that something had changed. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew that nothing would ever be the same again.